While walking with her son, the widow saw a man who looked exactly like her husband. What she discovers shocks her. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The morning sun filtered through the beige curtains of Aaliyah's apartment, casting soft, golden patterns on the wooden floor. The air was filled with the familiar aroma of fresh coffee and toast, the comforting scent that marked the beginning of another routine day. In the kitchen, she moved methodically, pouring cereal into a bowl for her son, Elijah, while absent-mindedly scrolling through emails on her phone. It had been 3 years since Jerome had died, but the ache had never really faded. It had dulled like an old scar, something she no longer actively thought about, but always carried with her. Every morning, she would wake up to an empty side of the bed, remind herself to breathe and move forward. It was a life built on structure, on carefully placed steps that ensured everything remained stable, at least on the surface. Elijah, 8 years old, sat at the small dining table swinging his legs beneath the chair, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He was growing fast, his once chubby cheeks now giving way to a sharper jawline, and every day he looked more like Jerome. The resemblance was striking. The same deep brown eyes, the same effortless smile. "Mom, can I get that new building set today?" His voice was hopeful, and she could already see the negotiation forming in his mind. "We'll see," she responded with a small smile, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. He groaned, already knowing what that meant. "You always say that." She ruffled his hair. "And I always mean it." The apartment was small but warm, filled with little remnants of the past. A framed wedding photo on the bookshelf, Elijah's drawings pinned to the refrigerator, a pair of Jerome's running shoes still sitting by the door, untouched. She hadn't had the heart to move them. Some things, she told herself, deserved to stay exactly where they were. After dropping Elijah off at school, Aaliyah headed to work. Her job as a legal assistant was steady, predictable, precisely what she needed. The office was a space of organization, of legal documents and deadlines where emotions had no place. Here, she could immerse herself in work and not think about the emptiness waiting for her at home. Her co-workers were kind but distant. They had learned not to ask too many personal questions. They knew about Jerome's passing, about how she had picked herself up and continued without missing a step. People admired her strength, but they didn't see the cracks beneath. And that was exactly how she wanted it. That afternoon, she picked Elijah up from school, and they decided to spend the rest of the day at the shopping mall, a rare break from their usual routine. The mall was buzzing with life. Children tugging their parents toward toy stores, teenagers loitering by food courts, couples strolling hand in hand. It had been a long time since Aaliyah had allowed herself to enjoy simple things like this. Elijah's excitement was contagious as they wandered from store to store. He was fascinated by everything: new books, sneakers, the latest electronic gadgets. Every few minutes he would stop to admire something, eyes lighting up with possibilities. "Mom, look." He tugged her hand, pointing toward the display of a new tablet. "That one is so cool." She chuckled. "Maybe for your birthday." They continued walking, stopping at different shops, their bags growing heavier with small purchases: a book for Aaliyah, a toy car for Elijah, a new pair of sneakers he had convinced her he absolutely needed. Then, everything changed in an instant. She saw him. At first, she thought her eyes were playing tricks on her. Standing by the glass display of an upscale watch boutique was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a sleek suit. The way he stood, the way he tilted his head slightly as he examined the watches, it was too familiar. Her heart clenched so tightly she could barely breathe. The man turned slightly, and her world stopped. It was Jerome. No, that was impossible. But the resemblance was undeniable. The sharp jawline, the deep brown skin, the confident posture, everything about him screamed of the man she had lost, the man she had buried. Aaliyah's grip tightened on her shopping bag. Her fingers trembled. She wanted to call out, but the words stuck in her throat. And then, as if sensing her gaze, the man turned his head. Their eyes met. For a split second, her breath caught, but there was no recognition in his gaze. The man barely hesitated before looking away, then turned and walked deeper into the mall. Aaliyah's feet moved before she could think. "Elijah, stay here," she said quickly, barely glancing at her son's confused face before she darted forward. She pushed past shoppers, weaving through the crowd, her heartbeat deafening in her ears. She caught glimpses of him ahead, a flash of his suit, the way he moved through the crowd with ease. Faster. She had to get closer. She turned a corner, and he was gone. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as she scanned the crowd, her eyes darting in every direction. But there was nothing. No sign of him. The man had vanished, as if he had never been there at all. Her hands shook as she clutched her bag to her chest, her mind racing. It wasn't possible. And yet, something inside her told her this wasn't just a coincidence. When she finally made her way back to where she had left Elijah, he was waiting with a frown. "Mom, what happened?" She forced a smile, though her body was still trembling. "Nothing, sweetheart." But it wasn't nothing, and Aaliyah knew she wouldn't be able to rest until she found out the truth. Aaliyah barely slept that night. The moment she closed her eyes, she saw him. The man in the mall, the sharp features, the familiar way he stood. Her mind refused to accept the impossible, but the image was burned into her thoughts. The logical part of her repeated the same rational explanation. It was just a coincidence. A stranger who happened to look like Jerome. But deep inside, something gnawed at her, an unease that wouldn't let go. By morning, she knew what she had to do. She needed answers. After dropping Elijah off at school, she found herself driving through the winding streets of Boston toward a house she hadn't visited in months. The neighborhood was quiet, lined with tall trees whose leaves had begun turning golden with the approach of autumn. It had been a long time since she had last seen Raymond, Jerome's father. The older man had been a pillar of support after her husband's passing, but as time went on, they had drifted apart. Aaliyah had kept her grief private, and Raymond had done the same in his own way. He had lost a son, and she had lost a husband, but they had mourned separately, unable to bridge the pain between them. Now, standing in front of his house, she hesitated before ringing the doorbell. The door creaked open, and there he was, Raymond, dressed in a simple gray sweater, his face more lined than she remembered. His once formidable presence had softened, his shoulders slightly hunched with age. His dark eyes flickered with surprise when he saw her. Without a word, he stepped aside and let her in. The living room smelled of old books and coffee, just as it always had. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm shadows across the furniture. On the mantel above the fireplace, Jerome's framed graduation photo still stood, untouched by time. Aaliyah sat down on the couch, her hands clasped tightly together. She hadn't realized how anxious she was until now. "I saw someone yesterday," she finally said, her voice steadier than she expected. Raymond sat across from her, watching her carefully. He didn't rush her. "He looked exactly like Jerome," she continued, Same height, same build, same face. It was uncanny. A long silence followed. Raymond's fingers tightened around the coffee mug in his hands. Aaliyah noticed the small tremor in them. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he sighed. "There's something I should have told you a long time ago." Her heart stilled. Raymond set down his mug and leaned forward, his expression weary, as if he had carried the weight of his next words for far too long. "When Jerome was born," he said slowly, "he wasn't alone." Aaliyah's breath hitched. He had a twin brother. The room seemed to shrink. She stared at him, unable to comprehend what she had just heard. Twin? Jerome had a twin brother? The words made no sense, colliding with everything she thought she knew. Raymond exhaled deeply, running a hand over his face. He looked exhausted. "It's not something I ever wanted to talk about," he admitted. "Not because I didn't care, but because it was complicated." Aaliyah's voice barely came out. "What happened to him?" Raymond's eyes darkened, his gaze dropping to the floor. "It was a different time. I was young, desperate. Your mother-in-law, God rest her soul, she died during childbirth. I was left with 2 newborns, drowning in debt, barely able to survive. And then an offer came." Aaliyah felt her stomach tighten. "What kind of offer?" Raymond hesitated, then met her eyes. "A wealthy couple. They couldn't have children. They offered to take one of the boys to raise him as their own. In return, they erased my debts, gave me a second chance at life." His voice was laced with regret. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought—" He stopped himself. "I thought I was saving them both." Aaliyah's mind spun. This was impossible. Jerome had never mentioned a brother. No one had. And yet, she had seen him, the man in the mall. Her breathing quickened. "Who were they?" she asked. "The couple?" Raymond shook his head. "I never knew much. They changed his name, moved away. I was told never to contact them. I convinced myself he had a better life, that I was doing the right thing." Her hands clenched into fists, and yet, all these years later, here he was, alive, walking around Boston, completely unaware that the man she had loved, the brother he had never met, was gone. Raymond sighed, rubbing his temples. "I always wondered if I made the right choice. If I had done things differently, maybe—" His voice trailed off. "But it's too late now." "No," Aaliyah said. He looked up, startled by the sharpness in her voice. "It's not too late." Raymond frowned. "What are you talking about?" Aaliyah's heart pounded as she stood. "I'm going to find him." Raymond looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Aaliyah, I have to," she interrupted. "I saw him, Raymond. I saw him with my own eyes. He's here, in Boston. And if you're right, if he doesn't know the truth—" She swallowed hard. "Then he deserves to." Raymond looked troubled. "And what if he doesn't want to know?" She hesitated but shook her head. "That's his choice. But I can't pretend I didn't see him. I can't just walk away." Raymond sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. "And how do you plan to do this? You don't even know his name." She straightened her shoulders. "I'll find it." And she would, because now nothing else mattered. The past that had been buried for decades had finally come to the surface, and Aaliyah was determined to uncover the truth. The weight of the truth settled over Aaliyah like a heavy fog. She had spent years mourning Jerome, believing she had lost the only man who had ever truly known her heart. But now she had learned that somewhere in this city, walking these same streets, was his brother, his twin, a man who had been given a completely different life. A man who, perhaps, had no idea he even had a brother at all. She couldn't ignore this. The moment she stepped out of Raymond's house, She felt a renewed sense of purpose. It was as if a hidden door had been unlocked, revealing a path she had never known existed. But it was a path filled with uncertainty. She didn't have his name. She didn't know where he lived, what he did, or even if he would listen to her. But she had seen him, and that meant he was real. Aaliyah sat in her car for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel as she planned her next move. The only clue she had was the image of him in the mall, the watch store where he had been standing, the suit he wore, the confident way he carried himself. A wealthy family, a man of success. If he had been adopted by people of means, there was a high chance he had grown up in privilege. That meant business, connections, influence. And influence left a trail. She started her search with the simplest method, the internet. At home, after tucking Elijah into bed, she opened her laptop and began typing every possible combination of words into the search bar. Boston, African American, wealthy family, businessman. Nothing. She refined it further. Successful black entrepreneurs in Boston. A long list appeared, filled with corporate executives, investors, and real estate developers. Too broad. She narrowed it down. Boston real estate CEOs. Her fingers tapped anxiously as she scrolled through the list of names, scanning the headshots attached to each biography. And then, her breath hitched. A familiar face stared back at her from the screen. A man in a sleek navy suit, arms crossed over his chest, his sharp features exuding confidence and authority. The same face she had seen at the mall. Her pulse raced as she read the name beneath the photo, Miles Hayward, CEO of Hayward and Company Development. He had a name. Aaliyah swallowed hard, her eyes darting across the page. There it was, a full biography. Miles Hayward was a self-made real estate mogul who had risen to prominence in Boston over the last decade. He had been adopted at birth by Philip and Lorraine Hayward, a couple deeply involved in the real estate industry. They had raised him to inherit the family business, and according to the article, he had done just that, taken the company to new heights, expanding their developments across the East Coast. There were mentions of prestigious awards, exclusive charity events, and a reputation for being ambitious, strategic, and relentless in his pursuit of success. Nowhere in his history was there a mention of a brother. Aaliyah stared at the screen, her fingers trembling over the keyboard. She had found him. But what now? She couldn't just show up at his office and tell him his entire life had been a lie. He wouldn't believe her. Why would he? She needed to be careful. She needed proof. The following morning, she called out of work and set her sights on the next step. If Miles had been raised by the Haywards, then his past had to be connected to them somehow. She dug deeper, searching for any traces of the adoption. It wasn't easy. The Haywards had been wealthy enough to keep certain records private, but after hours of scouring through old archives and genealogy databases, she finally stumbled upon a mention of a private adoption from over 30 years ago. There was no direct evidence linking it to Miles, but the dates matched. The secrecy surrounding the adoption only confirmed what Raymond had told her. It had been a closed arrangement, a trade-off that ensured no connection between the two brothers. Aaliyah exhaled shakily. She was staring at decades of buried truth, hidden behind money and careful decisions. Now she had to decide what to do with it. The next step was the hardest. She needed to see him again. That afternoon, she found herself standing outside Hayward and Company Development, an impressive glass skyscraper in downtown Boston. The name gleamed in silver lettering across the entrance, a reflection of the power and wealth Miles had built. She had never felt more out of place. But she had come this far. She wasn't leaving without trying. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The lobby was immaculate, polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a quiet hum of efficiency as employees moved with purpose. A receptionist sat behind a sleek desk, her headset barely visible beneath her flawless curls. Aaliyah approached, trying to steady her voice. "I need to speak with Miles Hayward." The receptionist barely glanced up. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's urgent." The woman gave her a polite but dismissive smile. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Hayward's schedule is completely booked. If you'd like, I can schedule a meeting for next month." Aaliyah shook her head. That wasn't an option. She had to think fast. "I'm his family." The receptionist's fingers hesitated over her keyboard. She finally looked up, her brows furrowing in confusion. "Excuse me?" Aaliyah nodded. "It's a personal matter. Please, just tell him I'm here." The receptionist seemed uncertain, but after a pause she picked up the phone and dialed an extension. Aaliyah's heart pounded as she listened to the murmured conversation. After a tense moment, the woman hung up and gave her an apologetic look. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Hayward is not available for unexpected visitors. I can leave a message." Aaliyah's stomach twisted with frustration. She had come all this way. She couldn't just walk away. But before she could protest, something caught her eye. A figure stepping out of the elevator across the lobby. Tall, confident, Miles. He hadn't seen her yet. He was speaking with a colleague, his expression focused as they walked toward the exit. This was her chance. Without thinking, Aaliyah moved. She stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper at first. "Miles." He didn't hear her. She tried again, louder this time. "Miles Hayward." The name made him pause. His brow furrowed as he turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Aaliyah felt the air thicken between them. He was staring at her, but there was no recognition in his face. Just confusion. Then guarded curiosity. She swallowed hard. For the first time, she was face to face with the man who should have been her brother-in-law. The man who had grown up in a different life, never knowing the brother he had lost. This was it. The moment that would change everything. Miles Hayward had always been a man who thrived on control. His world was structured, built on discipline and precision, every step calculated to ensure success. But the moment he locked eyes with the woman standing in the middle of his office lobby, he felt something slip. There was something in the way she looked at him. An intensity, a weight, like she knew him in a way that she had no right to. Aaliyah. That was the name the receptionist had given him when she had tried to get through earlier. But he had no idea who she was. And yet, something about her unsettled him. His business partner was still speaking, but Miles wasn't listening anymore. His focus was entirely on the woman standing just a few feet away. She stepped closer, hesitant but determined. "Miles," she said again, quieter this time, like she wasn't sure how to begin. He didn't like the way she said his name, like it meant something more than just a stranger addressing him. His instincts told him to walk away, but he didn't. Instead, he met her gaze, his voice firm. "Do I know you?" A flicker of something crossed her face. Sadness, relief, anxiety, all tangled together. "No," she admitted, "but you should." His patience was wearing thin. "If this is about business, you need to go through the proper channels. I don't do meetings in the middle of my lobby." "It's not about business." That gave him pause. Aaliyah's heart pounded in her chest. She could see the guarded skepticism in his eyes, the way he analyzed her with the same cool detachment he probably used in boardrooms and contract negotiations. He wasn't going to believe her if she just blurted out the truth here. "Please," she said, her voice softer now. "Just give me 5 minutes, that's all I ask." He studied her, weighing his options. Something in her expression made him relent. "Follow me." She exhaled in relief as he turned and led her toward a sleek, private office on the other side of the building. Once inside, he shut the door behind them. The space was vast, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Boston skyline. Everything about it reflected power, success, precision. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, but she remained standing. "Start talking," he said, arms crossed, his tone clipped. Aaliyah took a deep breath. "I know this is going to sound insane," she said, "but I need you to listen." His expression didn't change. "You were adopted," she said finally, 32 years ago, by Philip and Lorraine Hayward." His posture stiffened slightly, but his face remained impassive. "Did you ever wonder about where you came from?" she continued. "Did you ever question why there were no baby pictures before a certain age? Why your birth records were sealed?" She was pressing too hard, but she couldn't stop. "Your real name," she hesitated, steadying herself before saying it aloud. "You had a brother, a twin." His jaw clenched. "I don't have a twin," he said flatly. Aaliyah's voice softened. "You did." A long silence followed. He didn't speak, didn't move. She could see the gears turning in his mind, the way his carefully controlled reality was being pulled apart thread by thread. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," he said finally, his tone sharper now, "but I don't have a twin." Her hands tightened at her sides. "Yes, you do. His name was Jerome." Her voice faltered. "And he was my husband." That made him pause. For the first time, she saw something shift in his eyes, something uncertain, something raw. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small photograph, placing it on his desk. It was an old picture of Jerome, taken years ago before he had met her. Miles looked at it. Then, for the first time, he truly looked. The resemblance was undeniable. The same eyes, the same face. His fingers twitched slightly as he stared at the image. Aaliyah spoke carefully now, sensing that she was standing on fragile ground. "You weren't given up," she said. "You were taken. It was a deal, made to protect you both. Your biological father, his name is Raymond. He's still alive. He told me everything." Miles remained silent, his face unreadable. Aaliyah knew what he was feeling, because she had felt it too. Disbelief, shock, grief. "You can do whatever you want with this information," she said finally, "but I couldn't just let you walk past me without knowing the truth." Another silence. Then he looked at her, his voice quieter than before. "If this is true," he hesitated, "why didn't anyone tell me?" She swallowed. "Because the people who raised you wanted to protect you, and because Raymond thought he was making the right choice." Miles exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. She had dropped an earthquake into his life, and she knew he needed time to process it. So she stood, leaving the photo on the desk. "If you want to know more, I'll be waiting," she said. Then she walked away. The next few days passed in a blur. Aaliyah tried not to think about whether or not he would call. She tried to focus on her routine. Work, Elijah, the everyday responsibilities that kept her grounded. But her mind kept drifting back to Miles. And then, one evening, her phone rang. She almost didn't recognize the number, but when she answered, she heard his voice. "Where is he?" "Raymond." That was all he said. Aaliyah's breath caught. "He wants to meet you." A long pause. Then, "Tell me where." Raymond sat in his living room, his hands folded, his gaze distant. Aaliyah sat beside him, nervous. She had no idea how this would go, and then the doorbell rang. She opened the door, and there he was, Miles. For the first time in over 30 years, Raymond looked into the face of the son he had given away. The silence was heavy. Then Raymond's voice cracked. "I never stopped thinking about you." Miles didn't speak. He didn't move, but he stepped inside, and Aaliyah knew. This was the beginning of something new, something that had been waiting decades to be mended. A family, broken apart by the past, was finally finding its way back together. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. Check out our other videos and keep exploring more fascinating content. And if you enjoyed this, share it with your friends.